Military historian Dr. Catherine Marlowe had spent the better part of her career studying the human faces of war, but nothing had prepared her for the telephone call that arrived on a storm-lashed evening in November. The voice on the other end belonged to Thomas Ashfield, whose grandfather had left behind a collection of military memorabilia that the family had been reluctant to examine since his passing 3 months earlier. What Thomas had discovered among his grandfather's possessions was a formal military portrait that defied explanation. The photograph showed his great-uncle William Ashfield in full dress uniform, captured in 1914 just before his deployment to the Western Front. But when Thomas had taken the portrait to be professionally cleaned and restored, the conservator had made a discovery that challenged everything the family thought they knew about their war hero ancestor. "Doctor," Marlowe, Thomas said, his voice trembling with confusion, "I need you to see this photograph because what we found in it shouldn't be possible. My great-uncle William was photographed alone in that studio in 1914, but when they enhanced the image, they found another man's face reflected in the brass buttons of his uniform. Not William's face, but someone else entirely. Someone the family has never seen before." Catherine had encountered numerous mysteries during her research into First World War military records, but she had never investigated a case where a photograph appeared to contradict the basic facts of its own creation. She agreed to meet with Thomas the following day at the Imperial War Museum in London, where she maintained her research office and had access to the most comprehensive archives of Great War documentation in the world. Thomas arrived carrying a leather portfolio that had clearly been handled with reverent care. Inside was the restored portrait of William Ashfield, a striking image that captured the young soldier's determination and dignity in the formal style typical of pre-deployment photography from that era. William stood at attention in his immaculate uniform, his expression serious but confident, embodying the heroic idealism that had motivated millions of young men to volunteer for military service in 1914. But as Catherine examined the high-resolution restoration that Thomas had commissioned, she immediately understood why the discovery had disturbed him so profoundly. The brass buttons on William's uniform jacket, polished to mirror brightness for the formal portrait, had captured reflections with startling clarity. And while most of the reflections showed distorted images of the photographer's studio, one button clearly reflected the face of a man who was definitely not William Ashfield. The reflected face belonged to someone older than William, with different facial features, different hair color, and an expression of profound sadness that contrasted sharply with William's confident pose. Most unsettling was the fact that the reflected face appeared to be looking directly at the camera, as if aware that it was being photographed, despite not being physically present in the studio. Catherine used her magnifying equipment to examine the reflection more closely, noting details that would be crucial for any attempt to identify the mysterious figure. The man appeared to be in his 30s, with a mustache and clothing that suggested civilian rather than military dress. His eyes held a depth of sorrow that seemed inconsistent with the celebratory nature of William's pre-deployment portrait session. "Thomas," she said carefully, setting down her magnifying glass, "what can you tell me about the circumstances under which this portrait was taken? Do you have any family records that might provide context for understanding how this reflection came to appear in William's uniform buttons?" According to the family documentation that Thomas had brought with him, William Ashfield had been photographed at Morrison & Sons studio in London on September 12, 1914, just 3 days before his unit was scheduled to depart for France. The session had been arranged by William's parents as a farewell gift, creating a formal portrait that would preserve their son's image for posterity. The Morrison & Sons business records, which Catherine was able to access through the museum's archives, confirmed that William had indeed posed for a solo portrait on that date. The appointment book noted that he had arrived alone and that the session had lasted approximately 30 minutes, following the standard procedures for military portraits during that period. But Thomas revealed additional information that complicated the straightforward narrative of a routine portrait session. According to family letters that had been preserved along with the photograph, William had returned home from the studio in an unusually disturbed state, claiming that something strange had occurred during the photography session. In a letter to his fiancée Margaret, written the evening after the portrait session, William had described experiencing what he called an overwhelming sense of sadness while posing for the camera. He had felt as though someone else was present in the studio, someone who was watching him with intense emotion, despite being invisible to normal sight. William's letter continued with a description that proved remarkably relevant to the reflected face that had been discovered in his uniform buttons. He wrote that he had sensed the presence of an older man who seemed to be trying to communicate something important, someone who carried the weight of terrible knowledge about the future that awaited young soldiers like William. Catherine found William's written account fascinating, particularly because it had been composed before the photograph was developed and before anyone could have known about the mysterious reflection that would appear in the brass buttons. The letter suggested that William himself had been aware of some unusual presence during the portrait session, even though he couldn't see or identify the source of his unease. The investigation into William Ashfield's military service revealed a career that had been both heroic and tragic. He had served with distinction on the Western Front, participating in several major battles and earning commendations for bravery under fire. But like so many soldiers of his generation, William had paid a heavy psychological price for his service, returning from the war with what would now be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. William's post-war letters and medical records documented his struggle with nightmares, depression, and recurring visions of fallen comrades who seemed to visit him during his sleep. He had frequently mentioned seeing the faces of dead soldiers, particularly one older man, who appeared repeatedly in his dreams and who seemed to be trying to warn him about dangers that he couldn't understand. The description of this recurring dream figure bore a striking resemblance to the face reflected in William's uniform buttons. According to William's own writings, the man in his dreams was approximately 30 years old, with a moustache and eyes that held infinite sadness. Most significantly, William had written that this dream figure seemed to know about William's fate before William himself understood what awaited him. Catherine decided to expand her research beyond William's personal history, investigating the broader context of the Morrison & Sons photography studio to see if their records might provide additional clues about the mysterious reflection. The studio had operated in London from 1890 to 1925, specializing in formal portraits for middle-class and military clientele. The Morrison family business records, preserved in the London Metropolitan Archives, revealed that the studio had developed a reputation for producing portraits with unusual qualities that clients often described as capturing more than just physical appearance. Several testimonials from satisfied customers mentioned that Morrison & Sons portraits seemed to reveal hidden aspects of personality or emotional states that weren't immediately apparent during the sitting sessions. More intriguingly, Catherine discovered correspondence between studio owner James Morrison and various clients who had reported discovering unexpected details in their portraits after the photographs were developed. These discoveries ranged from reflections of deceased relatives in mirrors and metallic surfaces to subtle figures visible in backgrounds that had appeared empty during the actual photography sessions. Morrison's responses to these inquiries suggested that he was aware his studio was producing photographs with unusual properties, but he attributed these phenomena to the exceptional quality of his equipment and the sensitivity of his photographic plates, rather than to any supernatural causes. Morrison claimed that his cameras were capable of capturing visual information that was present during the photography sessions, but not necessarily visible to the human eye. Catherine found Morrison's explanations scientifically intriguing, particularly in light of early 20th century developments in photographic technology that had indeed made cameras more sensitive to various forms of light and electromagnetic radiation than human vision. It was theoretically possible that Morrison's equipment could have detected and recorded visual information that the photographer and subject had been unable to perceive directly. But the specific case of William Ashfield's portrait presented challenges that went beyond simple photographic sensitivity. The reflected face in his uniform buttons showed not just greater detail than would be expected from ambient light in the studio, but actually appeared to be looking directly at the camera with conscious awareness and intentional communication. Catherine consulted with Dr. James Hartwell, a specialist in early photographic techniques at the Victoria and Albert Museum, hoping to determine whether the reflected face could be explained through any known photographic processes from 1914. Dr. Hartwell's analysis of the portrait confirmed that it had been created using standard techniques and materials for that period, with no evidence of double exposure, composite imagery, or post-development manipulation. Most significantly, Dr. Hartwell's examination of the reflected face revealed that it had been formed through the same photographic process as the rest of the image, suggesting that whatever had created the reflection had been physically present in the studio during William's portrait session, even though it had been invisible to the photographer and subject. The technical authentication of the reflected face as a genuine photographic phenomenon, rather than an artifact or manipulation, deepened the mystery surrounding William's portrait. If the face had been created through normal photographic processes, then something or someone had been present in the Morrison studio on September 12, 1914, that had been visible to the camera but not to human observation. Catherine decided to research the history of the Morrison studio building itself, hoping to discover whether any events or circumstances might explain the presence of an invisible figure during William's portrait session. The building had been constructed in 1875 as a private residence before being converted to commercial use in 1890 when James Morrison established his photography business. The property records revealed a history that included several tragic events that might have created the emotional residue that some researchers believed could influence photographic processes. The original owner of the house, a merchant named Edward Hartley, had lost his eldest son Thomas in the Boer War in 1901. Thomas Hartley had been 31 years old at the time of his death, matching the approximate age of the figure reflected in William's uniform buttons. More significantly, Thomas Hartley had died just 3 days before he was scheduled to return home on leave, a circumstance that had devastated his family and left his father consumed with guilt over having encouraged his son's military service. Edward Hartley had never recovered from the loss, becoming increasingly obsessed with contacting his deceased son through spiritualist practices that were popular during the early 1900s. Catherine found additional documentation suggesting that Edward Hartley had converted part of his house into a shrine for his dead son, filling rooms with military memorabilia, photographs, and personal belongings that had been returned after Thomas's death in South Africa. When financial difficulties had forced the sale of the property in 1890, many of these memorial items had been left behind and incorporated into the photography studio that Morrison established in the building. The connection between Thomas Hartley's death and the appearance of his face in William Ashfield's portrait created a compelling narrative that explained both the identity of the reflected figure and the emotional content of William's letter, describing his unease during the photography session. If Thomas Hartley's spirit or psychic presence had somehow remained attached to the building where his memorial had been established, his appearance in William's portrait might represent an attempt to communicate his knowledge of the fate that awaited young soldiers heading to war. Catherine shared her discoveries with Thomas Ashfield, who responded with both fascination and concern about the implications of the research. If the reflected face truly belonged to Thomas Hartley, a soldier who had died in a previous war, then William's portrait might document a supernatural encounter between two men, separated by more than a decade, but united by their shared experience as young soldiers facing mortal danger. Thomas revealed additional family information that supported this interpretation of the mysterious reflection. According to his grandfather's recollections, William had never spoken directly about his experiences during the war, but he had frequently mentioned dreams and visions involving an older soldier who had tried to prepare him for the horrors he would encounter on the battlefield. This dream figure, whom William had called his guardian ghost, had apparently provided warnings and guidance that had helped William survive several dangerous situations during his military service. Family stories suggested that William's survival of multiple battles, including some where his entire unit had been decimated, might have been due to supernatural protection provided by this invisible companion. The possibility that Thomas Hartley had somehow become William's spiritual protector created a narrative that transformed the mysterious reflection from a simple photographic anomaly into evidence of ongoing connection between soldiers across different conflicts and time periods. The brass buttons that had captured Thomas's face might have served as a medium for communication between the living and the dead, allowing experienced soldiers to provide guidance and protection to those who would follow them into battle. Catherine decided to expand her research to include other military portraits from the Morrison studio, hoping to discover whether William's photograph was unique or part of a larger pattern of supernatural phenomena associated with the building's history as both a memorial site and a photography studio. Her investigation of the studio's archived negatives and client records revealed several other cases where military portraits had captured unexpected reflections, shadow figures, or facial images that couldn't be attributed to anyone physically present during the photography sessions. These discoveries occurred exclusively in portraits of soldiers who were photographed before deployment to combat zones, suggesting that the studio's supernatural activity was specifically connected to the emotional intensity of farewell portraits. One particularly relevant case involved Lieutenant Robert Manning, who had been photographed at Morrison's studio in 1916 before departing for the Somme offensive. Manning's portrait showed a reflected figure in the polished metal of his sword hilt, a face that the Manning family had eventually identified as belonging to Robert's deceased uncle, who had died in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. Like William Ashfield, Robert Manning had reported unusual sensations during his portrait session, describing a feeling of being watched by benevolent but sorrowful presence. Also, like William, Robert had survived the war despite participating in some of its most dangerous engagements, leading his family to believe that his deceased uncle had provided supernatural protection throughout his military service. The pattern of supernatural protectors appearing in pre-deployment portraits from Morrison's studio suggested that the building's history as a memorial site had created conditions that enabled communication between living soldiers and their deceased predecessors. The emotional intensity of farewell portraits, combined with the spiritual residue left by Edward Hartley's memorial to his dead son, might have created a unique environment where the boundaries between life and death became permeable. Dr. Hartwell expanded his technical analysis to include the other supernatural portraits from Morrison's studio, confirming that all of the reflected figures had been created through normal photographic processes rather than manipulation or double exposure. The consistency of the phenomena across multiple cases strengthened the evidence that Morrison's studio had indeed been experiencing genuine supernatural activity rather than photographic artifacts or coincidental pareidolia. Catherine contacted Dr. Elena Vasquez, a researcher at the University of Edinburgh who specialized in the intersection of psychology, spirituality, and historical trauma. Dr. Vasquez had studied cases where intense emotional experiences, particularly those involving military service and family loss, appeared to create lasting psychic impressions that could influence physical environments for decades or even centuries. According to Dr. Vasquez's research, locations that had been associated with profound grief, memorial practices, or intense emotional focus on deceased individuals could develop what she termed psychological resonance that made them sensitive to spiritual or psychic phenomena. The Morrison Studio building, with its history as both a memorial site and a place where families created lasting images of soldiers departing for war, represented exactly the type of location where such resonance might develop. Dr. Vasquez's analysis of the Morrison Studio cases suggested that the reflected figures in the military portraits represented genuine communication from deceased soldiers who had retained concern and protectiveness toward their living successors. The photographic process, with its chemical sensitivity and electromagnetic properties, might have provided a medium through which these spiritual connections could manifest in visible form. The research team had identified 17 documented cases of supernatural reflections in Morrison Studio military portraits, each showing similar patterns of deceased soldiers appearing as protectors or guides for living soldiers about to face combat. The consistency of these cases, combined with the documented survival rates of the photographed soldiers, suggested that the supernatural encounters had provided genuine benefits rather than simple psychological comfort. Catherine compiled her research into a comprehensive report that documented both the historical context of the Morrison Studio phenomena and the specific case of William Ashfield's portrait with its reflection of Thomas Hartley. The report established the supernatural reflections as a legitimate historical phenomenon that provided insights into how communities processed trauma, loss, and the ongoing dangers faced by military personnel. Thomas Ashfield had followed the research with growing understanding of his family's military heritage and the spiritual connections that had influenced his great-uncle's survival during the First World War. The discovery of Thomas Hartley's protective presence in William's portrait had transformed what had initially seemed like a disturbing anomaly into evidence of a benevolent spiritual guardian who had watched over William throughout his military service. The broader implications of the Morrison Studio research extended beyond the specific cases that had been documented, suggesting that spiritual connections between soldiers across different conflicts might be more common than historical records typically acknowledged. The photographs provided rare visual evidence of phenomena that had usually been recorded only through personal testimonies, dreams, and family stories that could be easily dismissed as imagination or grief-induced hallucinations. Catherine's work had established the Morrison Studio military portraits as a unique historical resource for understanding how spiritual beliefs and practices had provided psychological support for soldiers and their families during one of the most traumatic periods in modern history. The supernatural reflections represented a form of cultural continuity that connected soldiers across different wars and generations, creating networks of protection and guidance that transcended the normal boundaries of life and death. Dr. Hartwell had expanded his photographic analysis to include similar cases from other studios that had operated during the same period, discovering that the Morrison Studio was not entirely unique in producing military portraits with supernatural elements. Several other photography businesses that had operated in buildings with tragic histories or memorial associations had also documented cases of unexpected reflections, shadow figures, and other unexplained phenomena in their military portraits. This broader pattern suggested that the intersection of photographic technology, military culture, and spiritual beliefs during the early 20th century had created conditions that regularly enabled supernatural manifestations that were captured in lasting visual form. The Morrison Studio cases represented part of a larger phenomenon that had provided comfort and protection to countless military families during wartime. The research had practical implications for understanding how communities could develop mechanisms for processing collective trauma and maintaining spiritual connections across generations affected by military service. The supernatural military portraits demonstrated how cultural practices, physical locations, and emotional intensity could combine to create support systems that operated beyond conventional understanding of psychology and community resilience. Catherine continued her research into military supernatural phenomena, establishing an archive of documented cases where spiritual encounters had provided guidance, protection, or comfort to soldiers and their families. The Morrison Studio portraits remained the most visually dramatic examples of such phenomena, but they were part of a much larger pattern of spiritual activity that had influenced military culture throughout modern history. Thomas Ashfield had decided to donate his great-uncle's portrait to the Imperial War Museum, where it would be preserved as part of the permanent collection documenting the human experience of military service. The photograph had become more than a family heirloom. It represented evidence of the spiritual dimensions of warfare that were rarely acknowledged in official military histories, but had provided crucial psychological support to those who faced the realities of combat. William Ashfield's portrait, with its mysterious reflection of Thomas Hartley, had become an icon representing the invisible networks of protection and guidance that connected soldiers across different conflicts and time periods. The brass buttons that had captured Thomas's face served as a reminder that military service involved not just individual courage and sacrifice, but also spiritual connections that transcended the boundaries between life and death. The research had revealed that some military heroes carried more than just their own strength and determination into battle. They also carried the protective presence of deceased soldiers who maintained their commitment to safeguarding those who followed in their footsteps. The supernatural reflections in Morrison Studio portraits provided visual evidence of these spiritual connections, documenting a dimension of military experience that challenged conventional understanding of courage, survival, and the bonds that united soldiers across generations. As Catherine reflected on the years of research that had grown from Thomas Ashfield's initial discovery, she realized that the investigation had revealed something profound about the nature of military service and the spiritual resources that communities developed to support those who faced mortal danger in defense of their countries. The mysterious reflection in William's portrait had opened a window into a world where the boundaries between past and present, living and dead, became permeable in service of protecting those who carried forward the burden of military duty. The 1914 portrait continued to be studied by researchers interested in supernatural phenomena, military history, and the intersection of photography with spiritual experience. But more importantly, it served as a testament to the enduring connections that bound soldiers together across time, conflict, and even death itself, proving that some bonds of duty and protection were strong enough to transcend any boundary that seemed to separate those who served from those who had served before them. However, the investigation was about to take an unexpected turn that would expand the mystery far beyond anything Catherine had initially imagined. 6 months after publishing her preliminary findings on the Morrison Studio phenomena, she received a letter from the French Ministry of Defense that would fundamentally alter her understanding of supernatural military photography and its implications for military history. The letter, written by Colonel André Dubois from the Historical Service of the French Army, described similar phenomena that had been documented in French military archives dating back to the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. According to Colonel Dubois, French military photographers had been reporting unexplained reflections, shadow figures, and other supernatural manifestations in official portraits of soldiers since the introduction of formal military photography in the mid-1800s. Most significantly, the French archives contained hundreds of documented cases where soldiers who had been photographed with mysterious reflections or supernatural manifestations had demonstrated exceptional survival rates during subsequent combat operations. The French military had quietly maintained these records for decades, treating them as classified materials due to their potential implications for understanding soldier psychology and battlefield performance. Catherine flew to Paris immediately, bringing with her copies of all the Morrison Studio documentation and hoping to establish connections between the British and French cases that might reveal broader patterns in supernatural military photography. The French archives housed in the Château de Vincennes contained one of the most comprehensive collections of military photographic anomalies in the world. Colonel Dubois met Catherine at the archives, a distinguished officer in his 60s who had spent his career studying the psychological and cultural aspects of military service. His interest in supernatural military photography had begun decades earlier when he had discovered similar phenomena in portraits of his own family members who had served in various French military campaigns. "Dr. Marlowe," Colonel Dubois said, as he led her through the climate-controlled archive rooms, "what we have documented here challenges fundamental assumptions about the relationship between military service, spiritual belief, and battlefield survival. The patterns we have identified suggest that supernatural protection might be a more common factor in military success than official histories have ever acknowledged." The French archives contained over 300 documented cases of supernatural manifestations in military photography, spanning from the Franco-Prussian War through World War II. Each case had been carefully documented with detailed descriptions of the photographic anomalies, genealogical research into the identities of any supernatural figures, and follow-up investigations into the subsequent military careers of the photographed soldiers. The statistical analysis that the French military had conducted on these cases revealed extraordinary correlations between supernatural manifestations in military portraits and enhanced survival rates during combat. Soldiers whose photographs contained unexplained reflections, shadow figures, or other supernatural elements had survived combat at rates nearly twice as high as soldiers whose portraits showed no unusual phenomena. More remarkably, the enhanced survival rates appeared to extend beyond individual soldiers to entire military units that included personnel who had been photographed with supernatural manifestations. Regiments, companies, and battalions that contained soldiers with supernatural portraits had demonstrated superior performance in battle, lower casualty rates, and higher rates of successful mission completion than comparable units without such personnel. Colonel Dubois showed Catherine detailed case studies that documented specific examples of supernatural protection that had apparently saved the lives of French soldiers during major military campaigns. One particularly compelling case involved Captain Henri Moreau, whose 1916 portrait had shown the reflected face of his grandfather, who had died during the siege of Paris in 1870. According to military records, Captain Moreau had survived multiple situations during the Battle of Verdun, where his survival had defied rational explanation. He had been present during artillery bombardments that had killed everyone around him, had walked through machine gun fire that had mowed down entire platoons, and had led successful charges across no man's land during attacks where casualties had typically exceeded 90%. Captain Moreau's own combat reports, preserved in the archives, described receiving warnings and guidance from an invisible presence that had helped him navigate the most dangerous situations on the battlefield. He had frequently mentioned sensing his grandfather's presence during combat, particularly during moments when split-second decisions had meant the difference between life and death. The French documentation included detailed photographic analysis of Captain Moreau's portrait, confirming that the reflected image of his grandfather had been created through normal photographic processes rather than manipulation or double exposure. The technical verification paralleled the findings from the Morrison studio cases, establishing that supernatural reflections in military photography represented genuine phenomena rather than artifacts or coincidences. Catherine spent several weeks in the French archives, studying cases that revealed patterns and variations in supernatural military photography that expanded her understanding of the phenomenon far beyond what she had discovered in Britain. The French cases included not only reflected faces in metallic surfaces, but also shadow figures visible in backgrounds, transparent figures standing behind photographed soldiers, and even cases where deceased military personnel appeared to be actively participating in group portraits of living units. One of the most extraordinary French cases involved a group portrait of the 15th Infantry Regiment, taken in 1917, which showed several transparent figures in military uniforms standing among the living soldiers. Genealogical research had identified these figures as former members of the regiment who had been killed in earlier battles, apparently returning to maintain their connection with their surviving comrades. The 15th Infantry Regiment had subsequently distinguished itself during the final phases of World War I, earning more decorations and suffering fewer casualties than any comparable unit in the French army. The regiment's commanding officers had attributed their success to exceptional unit cohesion and morale, but the photographic evidence suggested that supernatural factors might have contributed to their extraordinary performance. Colonel Dubois had developed theoretical frameworks for understanding how supernatural protection might influence military effectiveness, drawing on research from psychology, parapsychology, and military science. His theories proposed that strong spiritual connections between living and deceased soldiers could create psychological and even physical effects that enhanced battlefield performance. According to Colonel Dubois' research, soldiers who believed they were receiving supernatural protection demonstrated increased confidence, improved decision-making under stress, and enhanced intuitive responses to danger that could be measured through objective performance metrics. These psychological benefits alone could account for significant improvements in survival rates, even without assuming direct supernatural intervention. But the French archives also contained evidence that suggested supernatural protection might involve more than psychological effects. Multiple cases documented instances where soldiers with supernatural portraits had received apparently impossible warnings about specific dangers, had been guided away from areas that were subsequently devastated by enemy action, and had demonstrated knowledge about enemy movements that exceeded any information available through normal intelligence channels. The most compelling example involved Lieutenant Paul Rousseau, whose 1918 portrait had shown the reflection of his brother Jacques, who had been killed at the Battle of the Marne in 1914. According to Lieutenant Rousseau's combat diary, he had received detailed warnings from Jacques about a planned German offensive that had not yet been detected by French intelligence. Acting on these supernatural warnings, Lieutenant Rousseau had repositioned his platoon just hours before the German attack commenced, moving them from positions that were subsequently obliterated by artillery bombardment to defensive positions that allowed them to repel the enemy assault with minimal casualties. The accuracy and specificity of the warnings Rousseau had received suggested access to information that could not have been obtained through normal means. Catherine found the French evidence both fascinating and troubling, as it suggested that supernatural phenomena in military photography might represent something more significant than simple psychological comfort or spiritual reassurance. If deceased soldiers could indeed provide tactical information and strategic guidance to their living successors, the implications for understanding the nature of consciousness, death, and spiritual communication were staggering. The investigation expanded to include archives from other European military organizations that had maintained records of unusual photographic phenomena. The German Imperial War Archives in Berlin contained similar documentation dating back to the wars of German unification in the 1860s, while the Austrian Military Archives in Vienna had preserved records of supernatural military photography from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Each national archive revealed similar patterns. Supernatural manifestations in military photography correlated with enhanced battlefield performance, improved survival rates, and access to information that exceeded normal intelligence capabilities. The consistency of these patterns across different military cultures, historical periods, and national contexts suggested that supernatural protection in military service represented a universal phenomenon rather than cultural artifacts specific to particular societies. Dr. Maria Hoffmann, a researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin, joined the expanding international investigation to provide scientific analysis of the psychological and neurological factors that might contribute to supernatural experiences in military contexts. Her research focused on how extreme stress, life-threatening situations, and intense emotional bonds could influence human consciousness and perception. According to Dr. Hoffmann's preliminary findings, soldiers facing mortal danger demonstrated measurable changes in brain activity that enhanced their sensitivity to subtle environmental cues, electromagnetic fields, and other phenomena that might normally be below the threshold of conscious awareness. These neurological changes could potentially enable perception of information or presences that were genuinely present, but not normally detectable. Dr. Hoffmann's research suggested that battlefield conditions might create altered states of consciousness that allowed soldiers to access forms of awareness and communication that were not available during normal civilian life. The intense emotional bonds between military personnel, combined with the life and death stakes of combat situations, might create psychological conditions that enabled genuine psychic or spiritual phenomena. The scientific framework that Dr. Hoffmann provided helped bridge the gap between documented supernatural phenomena and rational scientific investigation, offering explanations that could account for the observed effects without requiring acceptance of supernatural causation. Her work suggested that the enhanced performance and survival rates associated with supernatural military photography might result from measurable neurological and psychological factors rather than direct spiritual intervention. Catherine worked with Dr. Hoffmann to develop protocols for investigating contemporary military personnel who reported supernatural experiences, hoping to gather real-time data about the psychological and physiological factors that might contribute to such phenomena. Their research proposal attracted support from military organizations that were interested in understanding any factors that might enhance soldier effectiveness and survival rates. The contemporary research revealed that supernatural experiences remained common among military personnel, particularly those who had served in combat zones or who had lost close comrades during military operations. Modern soldiers reported sensing the presence of deceased comrades, receiving warnings or guidance from invisible sources, and experiencing enhanced intuitive awareness that helped them navigate dangerous situations. These contemporary accounts paralleled the historical cases documented in the archival research, suggesting that supernatural phenomena in military service represented consistent aspects of human experience that had persisted across different technological and cultural contexts. The availability of modern neurological monitoring equipment allowed researchers to document the brain activity changes that accompanied supernatural experiences, providing objective evidence for the altered consciousness states that Dr. Hoffmann had theorized. The research consortium had expanded to include military researchers from NATO countries, creating an international database of supernatural military phenomena that contained thousands of documented cases spanning 2 centuries of military photography and service records. The database revealed global patterns that challenged conventional understanding of consciousness, spiritual experience, and the psychological factors that influenced military effectiveness. Thomas Ashfield had become a central figure in the international research community, serving as an advocate for families whose military heritage included supernatural phenomena and helping to establish support networks for veterans who had experienced unexplained encounters during their service. His great-uncle William's portrait had served as the catalyst for a research project that had revealed the prevalence and significance of supernatural experiences in military culture. The research had practical implications for military training, veteran support services, and understanding of the psychological factors that contributed to successful military performance. Military organizations began incorporating awareness of supernatural phenomena into their training programs, helping soldiers understand that such experiences were common and potentially beneficial rather than signs of psychological dysfunction. The therapeutic applications of supernatural military research proved particularly valuable for treating post-traumatic stress disorder and other combat-related psychological conditions. Veterans who believed they maintained spiritual connections with deceased comrades demonstrated better recovery rates and more effective coping strategies than those who felt isolated by their losses. Catherine had established a permanent research institute dedicated to investigating supernatural phenomena in military contexts, with funding from government agencies, academic institutions, and veteran organizations that recognized the potential benefits of understanding these experiences. The Institute maintained the most comprehensive archive of supernatural military documentation in the world and provided resources for ongoing research into consciousness, spirituality, and military psychology. The Morrison Studio cases that had initiated the research remained among the most visually dramatic examples of supernatural military photography, but they were now understood as part of a much larger pattern of spiritual activity that had influenced military culture throughout modern history. The brass button reflections that had captured the faces of protective spirits represented a small but significant portion of the documented evidence for supernatural protection in military service. William Ashfield's 1914 portrait had become an icon representing the invisible networks of spiritual protection that connected soldiers across different conflicts, nations, and historical periods. The research had revealed that military service involved not just individual courage and training, but also spiritual connections that transcended the normal boundaries of life and death. The international database of supernatural military phenomena continued to grow as researchers identified additional cases from archives around the world. Each new discovery added to the understanding of how spiritual beliefs, emotional bonds, and extreme circumstances could combine to create experiences that challenged conventional scientific explanations while providing measurable benefits for military effectiveness and personnel welfare. Colonel Dubois had expanded his research to include analysis of how supernatural military phenomena varied across different cultural and religious contexts, revealing that while the basic patterns remained consistent, the specific manifestations and interpretations of spiritual protection reflected the diverse belief systems of military personnel from different backgrounds. The cross-cultural research had demonstrated that supernatural military experiences represented universal aspects of human consciousness rather than artifacts of particular religious or cultural traditions. Soldiers from Christian, Islamic, Buddhist, Hindu, and secular backgrounds all reported similar types of spiritual encounters, suggesting that the capacity for supernatural experience in military contexts transcended specific belief systems. Dr. Hoffman's neurological research had progressed to include real-time monitoring of brain activity during supernatural experiences, revealing consistent patterns of altered consciousness that correlated with enhanced cognitive performance, improved decision-making, and increased resistance to psychological stress. The scientific validation of supernatural experiences as measurable neurological phenomena had helped legitimize the research and expand its acceptance within mainstream academic and military communities. The therapeutic applications of supernatural military research had been integrated into veteran treatment programs across multiple countries, providing new approaches for addressing combat trauma, survivor guilt, and the psychological challenges of transitioning from military to civilian life. Veterans who participated in programs that acknowledged and validated their supernatural experiences demonstrated significantly better outcomes than those who received conventional treatment alone. Catherine's work had transformed from historical curiosity into practical application that was improving the lives of military personnel and veterans around the world. The investigation that had begun with a single mysterious reflection in a 1914 portrait had evolved into a comprehensive understanding of spiritual phenomena that offered both scientific insights and practical benefits for military communities. The research had also attracted attention from consciousness researchers, neuroscientists, and philosophers who were interested in the implications of supernatural military phenomena for understanding the nature of human awareness, the possibility of consciousness survival after death, and the mechanisms by which emotional bonds could influence physical reality. As Catherine reflected on the decade of research that had grown from Thomas Ashfield's initial discovery, she realized that the investigation had revealed something profound about human nature and the spiritual resources that enabled people to face extreme danger and sacrifice in service of others. The supernatural protection documented in military photography represented evidence that the bonds between people could transcend any limitation imposed by death, distance, or time. The 1914 portrait of William Ashfield, with its mysterious reflection of Thomas Hartley, continued to be studied and exhibited as a prime example of supernatural military photography. But more importantly, it served as a symbol of hope for military families, veterans, and anyone who had experienced the loss of loved ones in service to their country. The brass buttons that had captured Thomas Hartley's protective presence reminded viewers that military service involved carrying forward not just individual courage and duty, but also the accumulated wisdom, protection, and sacrifice of all those who had served before. The supernatural reflections in military photography provided visible evidence of the invisible networks of spiritual support that connected military personnel across generations, conflicts, and even death itself. The research had demonstrated that some aspects of military service transcended the physical world, involving spiritual dimensions that provided real and measurable benefits for those who faced danger in defense of others. The supernatural military photography, documented in archives around the world, served as proof that the bonds forged in military service were indeed strong enough to overcome any obstacle, including the apparent finality of death. Thomas Ashfield's decision to share his great-uncle's mysterious portrait had initiated a research project that had revealed the spiritual foundations of military courage and the enduring connections that sustained military communities through the darkest periods of human conflict. The investigation had shown that soldiers never truly served alone, but carried with them the protective presence of all those who had faced similar dangers and made similar sacrifices in the service of values greater than themselves. But the most extraordinary chapter of the research was yet to unfold. 3 years after the establishment of the international database, Catherine received an urgent communication from the Pentagon that would elevate the investigation to the highest levels of military and government attention. The message came from General Patricia Rodriguez, director of the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, who had been monitoring the supernatural military research with growing interest from the United States military establishment. General Rodriguez requested an immediate classified briefing on the supernatural protection phenomena, explaining that American military intelligence had been tracking similar patterns in contemporary combat operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. According to classified reports, U.S. military units that included personnel who had reported supernatural experiences were demonstrating significantly enhanced performance metrics across all measures of combat effectiveness. Catherine flew to Washington under strict security protocols, bringing with her a comprehensive presentation that documented the international research findings and their implications for understanding military effectiveness. The Pentagon briefing room was filled with senior military officers, intelligence analysts, and government scientists who had been cleared for access to what was being treated as potentially critical national security information. General Rodriguez opened the briefing by presenting classified data that paralleled the historical research Catherine had conducted, but focused on contemporary military operations. American forces in combat zones had been reporting supernatural encounters at rates that far exceeded anything documented in previous conflicts, with implications that extended beyond individual soldier experiences to operational and strategic military planning. According to the classified data, over 40% of American combat veterans from recent conflicts had reported some form of supernatural experience during their deployments, ranging from sensing the presence of deceased comrades to receiving warnings or guidance from invisible sources during dangerous operations. These reports had initially been dismissed as stress-related psychological phenomena, but statistical analysis had revealed correlations that demanded serious investigation. Military units with higher percentages of personnel reporting supernatural experiences had demonstrated measurably superior performance in combat situations, including lower casualty rates, higher mission success rates, and enhanced ability to detect and avoid improvised explosive devices and ambush situations. The statistical significance of these correlations had reached levels that could not be attributed to coincidence or reporting bias. Most remarkably, intelligence analysis had identified specific instances where supernatural experiences had provided American forces with tactical information that had proven accurate and valuable, including advance warning of enemy attacks, knowledge of enemy positions that had not been detected through conventional reconnaissance, and guidance toward hidden weapons caches and intelligence materials. The Pentagon had established a classified research program to investigate these phenomena, working with neuroscientists, psychologists, and intelligence specialists to understand the mechanisms involved and explore potential applications for enhancing military capabilities. The program had been operating under extreme secrecy due to concerns about public reaction and potential security implications of acknowledging supernatural factors in military operations. Catherine's historical research had provided crucial context for understanding the contemporary phenomena, demonstrating that supernatural experiences in military service represented consistent aspects of human consciousness rather than recent developments related to modern warfare or psychological stress. The continuity between historical and contemporary cases suggested that supernatural protection might be a fundamental aspect of military service that had been overlooked by conventional military science. The Pentagon briefing revealed that American military researchers had developed technologies for monitoring and potentially enhancing the neurological states associated with supernatural experiences, building on Dr. Hoffman's research into altered consciousness during combat situations. These technologies included electromagnetic field generators, biofeedback systems, and neurostimulation devices that could induce the brain activity patterns associated with enhanced intuitive awareness. Early testing of these enhancement technologies had produced promising results, with test subjects demonstrating improved threat detection, enhanced situational awareness, and increased accuracy in predicting enemy behavior during simulated combat scenarios. The technologies appeared to amplify natural human capabilities for supernatural perception rather than creating artificial psychic abilities. However, the ethical implications of using supernatural enhancement technologies in military applications had created significant controversy within the Pentagon research program. Critics argued that manipulating soldiers' consciousness and spiritual experiences represented unacceptable interference with fundamental aspects of human nature, while supporters claimed that enhancing natural protective abilities could save lives and improve mission effectiveness. Catherine found herself at the center of debates that extended far beyond historical research into questions about the nature of human consciousness, the ethics of military enhancement technologies, and the role of spiritual experience in modern warfare. Her documentation of historical supernatural protection had provided the foundation for contemporary applications that could revolutionize military capabilities while raising profound questions about the boundaries of acceptable military science. The classified briefing also revealed that other nations had been conducting similar research into supernatural military phenomena, creating a new dimension of international military competition focused on understanding and harnessing spiritual factors in combat effectiveness. Intelligence reports indicated that Russian, Chinese, and Israeli military organizations had all established programs investigating supernatural protection and enhancement technologies. This international dimension added urgency to the American research program, as military planners recognized that supernatural capabilities could provide strategic advantages that might determine the outcomes of future conflicts. The historical documentation of supernatural protection in military photography had become the foundation for contemporary military research programs that could influence global power balances. Catherine was asked to lead an expanded international research consortium that would coordinate supernatural military research among allied nations while maintaining security protocols that protected sensitive technologies and operational capabilities. The consortium would build on her historical research to develop comprehensive understanding of supernatural military phenomena and their applications for contemporary defense needs. The expansion of the research program required Catherine to relocate to a secure facility outside Washington, where she worked with teams of military researchers, intelligence analysts, and consciousness scientists to develop new approaches for investigating and applying supernatural protection phenomena. The facility housed the most advanced consciousness research laboratory in the world, equipped with technologies that could monitor and analyze every aspect of supernatural experiences in real time. Working with international partners, Catherine helped establish research protocols that could investigate supernatural military phenomena while respecting the cultural and religious beliefs of personnel from different backgrounds. The protocols ensured that participation in supernatural research remained voluntary, and that enhancement technologies would not be used to manipulate soldiers' spiritual beliefs or religious practices. The research revealed that supernatural military experiences varied significantly across different cultural contexts, with personnel from different backgrounds reporting phenomena that reflected their particular spiritual traditions and belief systems. However, the underlying neurological patterns and performance benefits remained consistent regardless of cultural interpretation, suggesting that supernatural protection operated through universal human capabilities that transcended specific religious or cultural frameworks. Field testing of supernatural enhancement technologies in controlled military exercises demonstrated that soldiers using the technologies showed measurable improvements in threat detection, decision-making under stress, and unit coordination during complex operations. The technologies appeared to amplify natural human intuitive capabilities rather than creating artificial psychic abilities, allowing soldiers to access information and awareness that was already present, but normally below the threshold of conscious perception. The success of the enhancement technologies led to limited deployment in special operations units, where the potential benefits outweighed concerns about experimental applications. Special Forces personnel using supernatural enhancement equipment reported improved mission effectiveness and enhanced ability to operate in dangerous environments with reduced risk of casualties or mission failure. However, the deployment of supernatural enhancement technologies also revealed unexpected complications that required additional research and development. Some personnel reported becoming dependent on the enhanced awareness provided by the technologies, experiencing anxiety and reduced confidence when operating without artificial supernatural support. Others reported that the technologies interfered with their natural spiritual practices or created conflicts with their religious beliefs about the source and nature of spiritual protection. Catherine worked with military chaplains, psychologists, and ethics specialists to develop guidelines for the responsible use of supernatural enhancement technologies that respected individual autonomy while maximizing the potential benefits for military effectiveness. These guidelines ensured that personnel could decline to use enhancement technologies without negative consequences for their military careers, and that alternative support systems were available for those who preferred traditional approaches to spiritual protection. The research program also investigated the long-term effects of supernatural military experiences on veterans' psychological and spiritual well-being. Follow-up studies of personnel who had participated in supernatural research revealed that most reported positive outcomes, including enhanced sense of purpose, improved coping with military-related stress, and stronger connections to spiritual and community support systems. However, some veterans reported difficulties adjusting to civilian life after experiencing enhanced supernatural awareness during military service. The transition from heightened spiritual sensitivity to normal consciousness could be challenging, requiring specialized support services and counseling approaches that acknowledge the reality of supernatural experiences while helping veterans integrate them into civilian life contexts. Catherine expanded her research institute to include veteran support programs that specifically addressed the needs of personnel who had experienced supernatural phenomena during military service. These programs provided counseling, support groups, and educational resources that helped veterans understand their experiences and develop healthy approaches for maintaining spiritual connections without dependence on military enhancement technologies. The Institute also established partnerships with religious organizations and spiritual counselors who could provide culturally appropriate support for veterans from diverse backgrounds. These partnerships ensured that veteran support services respected different religious traditions while providing practical assistance for integrating supernatural military experiences into civilian spiritual practices. International collaboration on supernatural military research had expanded to include not only NATO allies, but also neutral nations and international organizations interested in the humanitarian applications of consciousness research. The research had revealed that supernatural protection phenomena were not limited to military contexts, but could also benefit civilians in dangerous professions, emergency responders, and humanitarian workers operating in conflict zones. Catherine worked with the United Nations and various non-governmental organizations to develop applications of supernatural research that could enhance the safety and effectiveness of peacekeeping forces, disaster relief workers, and human rights investigators operating in high-risk environments. These applications focused on natural enhancement of intuitive awareness rather than technological augmentation, making them accessible to organizations without advanced military resources. The humanitarian applications of supernatural research proved particularly valuable for training programs that prepared civilians for work in dangerous environments. Personnel who received training in recognizing and developing natural supernatural awareness demonstrated improved situational awareness, enhanced ability to detect threats, and increased effectiveness in crisis situations. The research had also attracted attention from medical professionals interested in the therapeutic applications of supernatural awareness for treating trauma, anxiety, and other psychological conditions. Preliminary studies suggested that supervised development of supernatural sensitivity could provide therapeutic benefits for individuals who had experienced traumatic events, including military personnel, crime victims, and survivors of natural disasters. Catherine collaborated with medical researchers to develop protocols for integrating supernatural awareness training into therapeutic programs, ensuring that such applications met medical ethics standards while respecting the spiritual dimensions of healing and recovery. These protocols included safeguards to prevent exploitation of vulnerable individuals and requirements for informed consent from participants in supernatural therapy programs. The medical applications of supernatural research opened new possibilities for understanding the relationship between consciousness, spiritual experience, and physical health. Studies of personnel who had experienced supernatural protection during military service revealed correlations between spiritual awareness and improved immune function, faster recovery from injuries, and enhanced resistance to stress-related medical conditions. These medical findings provided additional scientific validation for the reality and benefits of supernatural experiences, helping to legitimize the research within mainstream medical and scientific communities. The documentation of measurable physiological benefits associated with supernatural awareness strengthened arguments for continued research funding and expanded applications of consciousness research. As the research program entered its second decade, Catherine reflected on how the investigation had evolved from historical curiosity about a mysterious reflection in a 1914 photograph to a comprehensive scientific program that was influencing military policy, medical practice, and understanding of human consciousness. The journey had revealed that supernatural experiences represented fundamental aspects of human nature that had profound implications for individual well-being and collective security. The original Morrison studio cases that had inspired the research remained important historical examples, but they were now understood as early documentation of phenomena that continued to influence human experience in contemporary contexts. The brass button reflections that had captured the faces of protective spirits represented visible evidence of invisible networks of support that operated throughout human society. Thomas Ashfield had remained involved in the research program as an advocate for families affected by supernatural military phenomena and as a liaison with veteran communities that had contributed to the research. His great-uncle William's portrait had become an iconic symbol of supernatural military protection, displayed in museums and research facilities around the world as evidence of the spiritual dimensions of military service. The research had demonstrated that military service involved more than individual courage, training, and technology. It also involved spiritual connections that transcended normal understanding of space, time, and consciousness. The supernatural protection documented in military photography and contemporary experiences provided evidence that soldiers carried with them not only their own strength and determination, but also the accumulated wisdom and protection of all those who had served before them. Catherine's work had established supernatural military research as a legitimate field of scientific inquiry with practical applications for military effectiveness, veteran support, and understanding of human consciousness. The research program she had initiated would continue for decades, exploring new dimensions of spiritual experience and developing new applications for enhancing human capabilities in dangerous and challenging environments. The 1914 portrait of William Ashfield, with its mysterious reflection of Thomas Hartley, would always hold a special place in the history of supernatural military research. It had served as the catalyst for discoveries that had revealed the spiritual foundations of human courage and the enduring connections that sustained communities through the most difficult challenges they faced. The brass buttons that had captured Thomas Hartley's protective presence continued to remind viewers that no one faced danger alone, that the bonds forged through shared sacrifice and service created networks of support that transcended the apparent limitations of individual mortality. The supernatural military research had provided scientific validation for ancient beliefs about the persistence of spiritual connections and the power of love and duty to overcome any obstacle. As Catherine continued her work leading the International Research Consortium, she remained guided by the wonder and humility that had characterized her investigation from its beginning. The supernatural phenomena documented in military photography and contemporary experience had taught her that human consciousness possessed capabilities that exceeded conventional scientific understanding, and that the bonds between people committed to serving others were indeed among the most powerful forces in the universe. The research had revealed that some aspects of human experience transcended the physical world, involving spiritual dimensions that provided real and measurable benefits for those who faced danger in service of others. The supernatural military protection documented around the world served as proof that the connections forged through shared commitment to values greater than oneself created realities that exceeded the limitations of conventional understanding, offering hope and strength to all who carried forward the burden of protecting and serving their communities.